In this video, me and my guest, Dr. Wolsiefer, are going to be talking about the effects of marijuana on performance when you're in school. Welcome to SGS Insights, where I create a variety of videos. We've got vlogs, we've got a talk show, we've got self-growth videos. Which one of my videos do you think you're about to watch? You did a study on weed itself, on academic performance. Like, what did you actually find in the study?
Sure. So I did this study while I was a graduate student at the University of Colorado Boulder, and we actually recruited undergraduate students, and we followed them for 3 years. And so once a year for 3 years, they would come into the lab, and we would ask them questions using a standardized interview procedure called the timeline follow-back procedure. And we would track their alcohol and their marijuana use over the past 30 days. And so we would ask them basically for every day, did you use weed? Did you use alcohol? How much? And we would record that, and then we would use a standardized method to turn that into kind of standardized quantities and frequency, so that we could compare, how much alcohol and marijuana you're using to how much I'm using. Mm-hmm. We did this every year for 3 years, and we collected other data too, but I'm just going to focus on that for now. And then at the end of the study, we got permission from these participants to collect their transcript information from the university. So we're not relying on self-report. We got the university to actually give us their GPA every semester of their college career, how many credits they had taken every semester, how many credits they'd earned, right? So those might be different if you withdrew from a class or failed a class. And that allowed us to look at a few different things. So we could look at how does marijuana use relate to your GPA in the subsequent semester? How does your marijuana use in a given year relate to the number of credits you sign up for the following semester? And how does it relate to the number of credits you actually earn at the end of that semester? Because we followed people for multiple years, we could also do this kind of cool statistical thing, and I will keep it brief. But what it allowed us to do was look at two different types of changes in alcohol and marijuana use. We could compare within-person changes. So we could say, if I start out not really using a lot of marijuana at all, how does an increase in use for me change my GPA? But we could also look at between-person changes. So if I'm the type of person who uses more marijuana than you, we could also compare our GPAs to see if there are between-person differences in GPA based on marijuana and alcohol use.
Wow.
Make some sense?
Oh yeah, for sure.
So we measured both alcohol and marijuana use because we know that these two things tend to go together. And there is a ton of research on alcohol use that suggests that alcohol use is, unfortunately for many college students, very bad for academic performance. And there is some evidence that marijuana use is bad for academic performance. But because these things go together, we didn't know if there were unique effects of marijuana use over and above what we can already capture with alcohol use. So measuring these two things in the same study allowed us to say, what is the unique effect of alcohol use on academic performance? What is the unique effect of marijuana use on academic performance? And what we found is a little bit complicated, but I can give you a few major takeaways here.
For sure.
The first major takeaway is that by themselves, with nothing else in our statistical models, both alcohol use and marijuana use negatively predict academic performance. So people who used more alcohol, people who used more marijuana, tended to have lower GPAs and actually take fewer credits each semester, which you could think if you're always taking fewer credits than recommended each semester, that could lead to delays in graduating.
Wow.
However, when we put those two things in a model together to look at the unique effects, what we tend to find is that often the marijuana effects are there over and above any effects of alcohol use. So we have some evidence that marijuana continues to matter even once we've measured alcohol use as well. It gets a little more nuanced than that, but I'm trying to keep things simple for our purposes here today. The last thing that I will mention, and this part is particularly interesting, but I'm going to speculate a little bit. We also had all sorts of additional information we collected from these participants, like were they in-state or out-of-state students? Because there's a stereotype at CU Boulder that out-of-state students are really coming to CU to party, whereas in-state students might be coming there because it's their home school and in-state tuition is cheaper. We also measured gender, so we could look at the differential effects for men and women. And we collected from these students a measure that is called PGPA, predicted GPA. And this is a number that many colleges will calculate for each of their students when the student gets accepted to the school. It's based on your high school GPA and your standardized test scores like SAT or ACT test scores. And it's used to make an estimate of, is this student likely to succeed in college, right? So it's a combination of those two things. It kind of tells us how well was a student doing before they got to college academically. When we put PGPA into our model, all the effects of substance use get wiped out. And what that tells us is that any explanatory power that marijuana or alcohol use had in explaining differences in GPA or differences in credits earned or attempted can actually be explained by previous high school academic performance. And this is the part where we're going to speculate a little bit. But we speculate based on some previous findings that what that might suggest is is that any effects that substance use are having on academic performance might actually kind of be settled or determined by whatever your substance use patterns are before you even get to college, right? So we know that many people begin experimenting with alcohol and marijuana in their teenage years, right, before they even come to college. And so what might be even more important than use during college is, when did you start trying these things, and when did you become a habitual marijuana or alcohol
That's
user?
a big one. Yeah, because in middle school, if kids are smoking weed, I read that it kind of affects the prefrontal cortex from developing and the emotional centers. So that's very true. So we should almost kind of start like looking at it at middle school per se instead of college, because yeah, you're right. There's a lot of factors there.
Absolutely. So I would say, this is only one study, and it's a correlational study. So as because you're in my class, we can't infer causation from a correlational study. But because we're measuring things over time, we can kind of get a sense of whether one thing is leading to another, even if we can't be sure. So yeah, I think continuing to study college students is important, but I think our study does highlight a need to also really focus on even younger students and better understand how age of first use and patterns of frequency and quantity of use at earlier ages might have later very serious consequences for academic performance.
That's huge. So we know that weed can affect academic performance. Is there like situations where it's much better to kind of maybe smoke weed or maybe have edibles where it's not going to affect you as much, maybe on a weekend, or in general it's going to like affect you either way?
Sure. So again, I want to be very clear. Lots of research suggests that separate from like your GPA, using more marijuana, things like that, can affect what's called your executive function, your ability to kind of like do involved cognitive tasks, right? Like heavy thinking kinds of tasks, and to kind of self-regulate, to control, and engage in behaviors that help you achieve goals. That said, I think, making sure that you are not using substances when you go to class. We know that when we learn new information or remember new information, that is a little bit dependent on our psychological state, right? So we want to go to class and make sure that we are fully able to attend and pay attention, so that when we have to go take exams or write papers, we're in the right mindset to do so. Similarly, when we take exams, write papers, probably not a great time to use alcohol or marijuana. And then the last thing that I would say, kind of based on what we've been talking about in terms of age of first use, is if you have not started experimenting with alcohol or marijuana yet, I would delay that as long as possible. We know that your prefrontal cortex is developing up through your mid-20s, your early to mid-20s, right? So if you are interested in those and trying out those things, but you haven't yet, or you can limit your use until you've let your brain fully develop and then give yourself a chance to try those things. That's probably the safest way to do so. Although I want to be clear, I'm not advocating for use of any kind.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, that's smart. I mean, because we're not doctors or anything per se. And also too, so like I was looking at a study, and so like they kind of tracked workers, and they found that if there was smoke after work, it's not going to affect them as much. But if they were to kind of smoke and then go to work, they had a harder time kind of speaking with their clients, actually getting things done, because their mind's all over the place. So that just really fascinates me.
Yeah, it's I think very similar to the idea of being drunk. You wouldn't, I think most people, unless maybe you're suffering from an addiction, would not show up at work drunk, right? Because it alters your mental state. It changes the way you consider what behaviors are appropriate. It changes the way you interact with other people. It changes your ability to It changes your dexterity, your reaction time, right? That's why we don't drink and drive. And so although the effects are different for marijuana, marijuana has similar effects on our psychological state, right? It changes the way we self-monitor. It changes the way we interact with other people. And so, you're really setting yourself up for a bad time if you're changing your mental state in those ways before you go into a professional environment.
It almost seems like to me like people don't really see weed as something that can affect their performance as much. Sometimes they'll say it helps me focus, helps me with anxiety. Like when they say those things, I think to myself, that might be true, but at the same time, like we don't want to depend on weed for things like that. And perhaps you're having kind of withdrawals anyway if you're feeling inshicks.
Yeah, and I think that brings up this interesting idea that substances that we consume, right, whether those are drugs like alcohol or marijuana, or whether those are, other drugs that we think of as more for medical purpose, traditionally for medical purposes, there might be positive effects and negative effects of those things, right? So for marijuana and alcohol, we know that they have these negative effects of changing our reaction times, changing our ability to think critically, to think through things, changing the way we interact with people. But there is some emerging research that suggests that there may be some positive benefits of marijuana use for things like anxiety or certain medical conditions. That said, that doesn't mean it can't also have negative effects. So just like with any medication, right, you'd want to talk to a doctor, you'd want to understand what the consequences of using that substance would be, both positive and negative, so that you can make the best decision for yourself. Just like if I choose a drug to take, say, for anxiety or depression that's over the counter, that's probably going to come with side effects, right? And I have to decide, do those side effects outweigh the utility of taking that drug?
I really like that a lot because that reminds me of another study I looked at. So they combine like CBD and 15 milligrams of weed. And then what they found out, so like when they combined those two, participants kind of had a harder time sleeping and everything like that. But when they kind of lowered the doses to 5 milligrams for each substance, it had a better effect. The people felt more alert and everything like that. So like I really agree, like having lower dosages and actually knowing, okay, how much is actually good to take.
Yeah, I think that's a really good illustration too of this, the importance of, any one study is only going to tell us a small piece of the picture, right? It's going to give us some piece of evidence, but it's not going to paint the whole picture. So previous research that suggests that, alcohol or marijuana use can lead to these negative cognitive effects. It doesn't mean that research is wrong, but maybe the story is a little more complex and it really matters how much you're using, right? A 5 milligram microdose might affect people very differently than, trying to keep it professional, than a 20 milligram edible or something like that, right?
Oh yeah, for sure. That's great. Wow. Well, thank you, Dr. Wolsiefer. You definitely shared a lot of great insight that I believe students can definitely use.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. This is the end of the video. I really hope you guys found a lot of insight from this. Dr. Wolsiefer definitely shared a lot of great information about marijuana because it is getting popular in America and all over the world for that matter. So to get a good understanding how it can affect your performance in school is just very crucial. I create a lot of videos along these lines. A few of them will pop up here. You guys should definitely check them out. And I'll see you guys next video.